Found out my business mentor was stealing my ideas to patent them himself. The intellectual property lawsuit bankrupted him. 3 years ago, I was just another guy with big dreams and zero connections in the tech world. Fresh out of college with a degree that felt more like expensive toilet paper, I was working dead-end jobs while sketching invention ideas in notebooks during my lunch breaks. My roommate kept telling me I needed to find someone who actually knew what they were doing in business, someone who could guide me through the maze of patents, investors, and all that corporate nonsense I had no clue about. That's when I met him at a local entrepreneur meetup in downtown Chicago. Gray-haired, expensive suit, confident handshake that made you feel like you were shaking hands with success itself. He had this whole aura about him that screamed experience and wisdom. During his presentation, he talked about how he'd helped dozens of young inventors turn their ideas into million-dollar companies. He showed photos of himself with people who looked important, mentioned big companies by name, and had this way of speaking that made you believe he could make your wildest dreams come true. After his talk, I approached him with sweaty palms and a nervous stutter. I had this idea for a smart home device that could revolutionize how people interact with their living spaces. It wasn't just another voice assistant or fancy thermostat. This was something completely different, something that could learn your daily patterns and anticipate your needs before you even realized you had them. When I explained the concept to him, his eyes lit up like Christmas morning. He invited me to coffee the next day, and that's where everything really started. He listened to my ideas with the kind of attention that made me feel like the smartest person in the room. He asked detailed questions about the technology, the market potential, the manufacturing process. He even took notes on a leather-bound notebook that probably cost more than my monthly rent. By the end of our 2-hour conversation, he offered to mentor me completely free of charge. Looking back now, I should have been suspicious about the free part. Nothing in life comes free, especially not guidance from someone who supposedly had decades of experience and connections worth millions. But I was young, desperate, and completely blinded by the possibility of finally making something of myself. When someone throws you a lifeline while you're drowning, you don't question the rope. The mentorship started innocently enough. We met every Tuesday evening at his office, which was this impressive space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. He had awards on the walls, certificates from organizations I'd never heard of, and a bookshelf filled with business books that looked like they'd actually been read. During our sessions, he'd ask me to walk him through my latest ideas, explain the technical details, and show him any sketches or prototypes I'd been working on. He was incredibly encouraging and always had suggestions for improvements. Sometimes he'd point out flaws in my designs that I'd completely missed. Other times, he'd suggest additional features that would make the product more marketable. He had this way of taking my rough ideas and helping me refine them into something that actually made sense from a business perspective. What really impressed me was how he'd send me follow-up emails after our meetings. These weren't just basic summaries of what we discussed. He'd include detailed technical specifications, market research data, and even rough diagrams of how my ideas could be implemented. He claimed he was just helping me organize my thoughts, but looking back, I realize he was documenting everything with surgical precision. About 6 months into our mentorship, he suggested I start keeping better records of my ideas. He recommended this specific software for inventors that would timestamp and organize all my concepts. He even helped me set it up on my laptop during one of our meetings. The program seemed legitimate enough, and he explained that having proper documentation would be crucial when it came time to file for patents. Around this time, I noticed he started asking more specific questions about my manufacturing ideas. He wanted to know about costs, suppliers, production timelines, and distribution channels. He said these details would be important when we started approaching investors, which he promised would happen soon. He even mentioned that he had a few potential investors who might be interested in my smart home concept. The first red flag should have been when he started suggesting modifications to my ideas that seemed unnecessarily complicated. He'd take my simple, elegant solutions and propose changes that would make them more expensive to manufacture and harder to implement. When I questioned these suggestions, he'd explain that investors preferred more sophisticated technology because it seemed more valuable and harder for competitors to replicate. Another warning sign was how he always insisted on having digital copies of all my work. He claimed his investor contacts preferred to review ideas electronically rather than meeting in person. He'd ask me to email him my latest sketches, technical specifications, and business plans after every meeting. Sometimes he'd even ask me to send him multiple versions of the same idea with different technical approaches. The breakthrough moment came when I was working on a particularly complex sensor array design. I'd been struggling with the technical specifications for weeks, trying to figure out how to make all the components work together efficiently. During one of our Tuesday meetings, I explained my challenges to him in detail, including the specific technical hurdles I was trying to overcome. 2 weeks later, I was browsing through some patent databases for research purposes when I stumbled across something that made my blood run cold. There was a patent application filed just days after our meeting that described the exact same sensor array design I'd been working on. The application was incredibly detailed, including technical specifications and implementation methods that were virtually identical to what I'd shared with my mentor. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe someone else had come up with the same idea independently. But as I read through the patent application more carefully, I found details that were too specific to be accidental. The applicant had used the exact same technical terminology I'd used in my emails, referenced the same manufacturing processes I'd researched, and even included design elements that were unique to my specific approach. The patent application was filed under a company name I'd never heard of, but a quick search revealed that my mentor was listed as the primary inventor and CEO. My hands were shaking as I printed out the entire application and compared it to my own notes and emails. The similarities weren't just striking, they were damning. That night, I barely slept. I spent hours going through every email I'd sent him, every document I'd shared, every idea I'd discussed during our meetings. The pattern was undeniable. Within days or weeks of sharing each concept with him, he'd filed patent applications that covered the same technology with remarkable precision. I realized that the software he'd recommended for organizing my ideas was probably sending copies of everything directly to him. The follow-up emails he'd sent weren't just helpful summaries. They were detailed records he could use to file his own patent applications. Even his suggestions for making my ideas more complex suddenly made sense. He was adding unnecessary complications to make his versions seem different enough from mine to avoid obvious plagiarism accusations. The worst part was realizing how systematic his approach had been. This wasn't some opportunistic theft where he'd stolen one good idea and run with it. He'd been methodically documenting and stealing every single concept I'd shared with him over the course of nearly a year. My trust in him had been his greatest asset, and my eagerness to learn had been his perfect cover. I spent the next few days in a state of shock and rage that I'd never experienced before. Every emotion hit me at once: betrayal, anger, humiliation, and a deep sense of violation that was hard to put into words. This man had taken advantage of my inexperience and desperation. He'd pretended to care about my success while systematically stealing the ideas I'd spent months developing. My first instinct was to confront him directly, but I knew that would be a mistake. If I tipped him off that I'd discovered his scheme, he might try to cover his tracks or accelerate his patent applications. Instead, I decided to do some more research and figure out exactly how extensive his theft had been. I spent the next 2 weeks diving deep into patent databases, searching for any applications that might be related to my ideas. What I found was even worse than I'd initially suspected. He hadn't just stolen my smart home sensor concept. He'd filed patent applications for at least 6 different ideas I'd shared with him over the months we'd been working together. Some of the applications were almost identical to my original concepts, while others had been modified just enough to seem different on the surface. But the core technologies, the fundamental approaches, and even some of the specific implementation details were clearly derived from my work. It was like looking at my own ideas through a funhouse mirror, recognizable, but distorted just enough to seem different. The financial implications started to sink in as I researched the potential value of these patents. If any of them were approved and the products were successfully commercialized, we were talking about potentially millions of dollars in royalties and licensing fees. Money that should have been mine was going to end up in his pocket because he'd managed to file the paperwork first. I also discovered that he'd been much more successful than I'd realized. Several of his previous patent applications had been approved, and he'd already licensed some of the technology to major companies. The awards on his office wall and the impressive lifestyle he maintained weren't just for show. He'd built a very lucrative business around stealing ideas from naive inventors like me. That's when I realized I needed help from someone who actually knew what they were doing. I couldn't fight this battle alone, and I certainly couldn't afford to make any more mistakes. I started researching attorneys who specialized in intellectual property law, particularly those who had experience with patent disputes and invention theft cases. The first few consultations were discouraging. Most of the attorneys I spoke with seemed skeptical about my chances of success. They explained that patent law heavily favors whoever files first, regardless of who actually invented the technology. They also warned me about the enormous costs associated with intellectual property litigation and the uncertain outcomes even in the strongest cases. But the fourth attorney I consulted had a different perspective. She specialized in cases involving invention theft and had successfully represented inventors who'd been taken advantage of by mentors, partners, and employers. She looked at my documentation, reviewed the patent applications I'd found, and told me that I had a stronger case than most people in my situation. The key advantage I had was the detailed email trail between my mentor and me. Because he'd been so thorough in documenting our conversations and following up with detailed summaries, I had timestamped evidence showing that I'd shared each idea with him before he filed his patent applications. I also had my original sketches and notes, which were dated and could be verified through various digital timestamps. Even more importantly, she explained that patent law includes provisions for cases where someone files applications for inventions that aren't actually their own. If I could prove that my mentor had essentially committed fraud by claiming to be the inventor of my ideas, his patent applications could be invalidated and potentially transferred to me as the actual inventor. The attorney agreed to take my case on a contingency basis, which meant I wouldn't have to pay her fees unless we won. This was crucial because I definitely couldn't afford to pay legal fees up front. However, she warned me that even with a contingency arrangement, I'd still be responsible for court costs, expert witness fees, and other expenses that could add up to tens of thousands of dollars. I spent several sleepless nights trying to decide whether to move forward with the lawsuit. The financial risk was enormous, and there was no guarantee we'd win even with strong evidence. But the alternative was letting this man get away with stealing my ideas and potentially doing the same thing to other young inventors in the future. What finally convinced me to proceed was something my attorney discovered during her initial investigation. She found evidence that my mentor had been running this same scam for years, targeting young inventors who were desperate for guidance and mentorship. I wasn't his first victim, and I probably wouldn't be his last unless someone finally held him accountable. We filed the lawsuit on a cold Tuesday morning in February. The legal documents were thick and filled with technical language I barely understood, but the core message was clear. I was accusing my former mentor of systematically stealing my inventions and filing fraudulent patent applications. We were asking the court to invalidate his patents, transfer them to me, and award damages for the theft of my intellectual property. His response came quickly and aggressively. He hired a team of expensive attorneys who immediately filed motions to dismiss the case, claiming that my allegations were baseless and that I was simply a disgruntled former student who was trying to profit from his legitimate business activities. They painted me as an inexperienced inventor who was confused about how the patent system worked. The discovery phase of the lawsuit was brutal and exhausting. Both sides were required to turn over all relevant documents, emails, and records related to the case. This meant that every email I'd ever sent to my mentor, every sketch I'd ever shared, and every note I'd ever taken during our meetings became evidence in a legal battle that would determine the fate of my inventions. But discovery also revealed information that strengthened my case considerably. My attorney's subpoenas uncovered internal emails and documents from my mentor's company that showed he'd been systematically targeting young inventors for years. They developed a sophisticated system for identifying promising inventors, gaining their trust, and then filing patent applications based on their ideas. Even more damaging was the discovery of a training manual he'd created for other people who wanted to replicate his business model. The manual literally outlined step-by-step instructions for identifying vulnerable inventors, building relationships with them, and then legally stealing their ideas through strategic patent filings. It was like finding a smoking gun that proved his entire operation was built on fraud. The depositions were particularly intense. I had to sit in a conference room for hours, while his attorneys grilled me about every detail of my relationship with their client. They tried to make me admit that I'd learned everything from him, that my ideas weren't original, and that I was simply trying to profit from his expertise and guidance. But when it was my turn to question him during his deposition, the tables turned completely. Faced with the evidence my attorney had uncovered, He struggled to explain how he'd independently developed ideas that were virtually identical to concepts I'd shared with him months earlier. His explanations became increasingly convoluted and contradictory as we presented him with time-stamped evidence of our conversations. The breakthrough moment came when my attorney asked him to explain the technical details of one of his patent applications. It quickly became clear that he didn't actually understand the technology he'd claimed to invent. He couldn't explain how the components worked together, couldn't describe the manufacturing process, and couldn't answer basic questions about the scientific principles involved. This was crucial because patent law requires that the listed inventor actually understand and be able to implement their claimed invention. If someone files a patent application for technology they don't understand, it's strong evidence that they're not the actual inventor. My attorney used this to devastating effect, demonstrating that my mentor had filed applications for inventions he couldn't even explain. The case took almost 2 years to work its way through the court system. During this time, I had to put my life on hold while dealing with the constant stress and uncertainty of the litigation. I couldn't move forward with any of my other invention ideas because everything was tied up in the lawsuit. I couldn't even talk publicly about my case because my attorney advised me to keep quiet until the legal proceedings were finished. The financial strain was enormous. Even though my attorney was working on contingency, I still had to pay for expert witnesses, document production, court reporters, and dozens of other expenses that added up quickly. I had to take out loans and max out credit cards just to keep the case moving forward. There were times when I seriously considered giving up just to make the financial pressure stop. But my attorney kept reminding me that we were fighting for more than just my individual case. If we could prove that my mentor had built his entire business around stealing ideas from young inventors, it would send a message to others who might be running similar scams. We were potentially protecting future inventors from falling victim to the same kind of systematic fraud. The trial itself was scheduled to last 2 weeks, but it ended up taking almost a month because of the complexity of the technical evidence. My attorney had to explain to the jury how patent law works, how invention theft occurs, and why the evidence showed that my mentor had committed fraud. The opposing attorneys tried to confuse the jury with technical jargon and complex legal arguments designed to make the case seem too complicated to understand. I had to testify for 2 full days, explaining my background, my relationship with my mentor, and the development of each invention that was at the center of the lawsuit. The opposing attorneys tried to make me look like a bitter former student who was trying to profit from my mentor's success. They questioned my technical expertise, my business experience, and even my motivations for pursuing the case. But the evidence was overwhelming. My attorney presented the jury with a clear timeline showing how I'd shared each idea with my mentor, and when he'd subsequently filed his patent applications. She showed them the emails, the meeting notes, the technical specifications, and the training manual that proved he'd been systematically stealing ideas from multiple inventors. The expert witnesses were particularly effective. My attorney had hired several respected patent attorneys and invention experts who explained to the jury how unusual and suspicious my mentor's pattern of patent filings was. They testified that the similarities between my ideas and his patent applications were far too extensive to be coincidental. The most compelling witness was another inventor who'd been victimized by my mentor several years earlier. She testified about how he'd used exactly the same tactics on her, gained her trust through mentorship, and then filed patent applications for her ideas. Her testimony showed that my case wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a deliberate and systematic pattern of fraud. When the jury returned their verdict after 3 days of deliberation, I was sitting in the courtroom with my hands shaking and my heart racing. I'd invested 2 years of my life and every penny I could borrow into this case. If we lost, I'd be financially ruined and would probably never recover from the debt I'd accumulated. The foreman stood up and read the verdict that changed everything. They found in my favor on all counts. The jury determined that my mentor had committed fraud by filing patent applications for inventions that weren't his own. They invalidated all of his patent applications related to my ideas and transferred the rights to me. They also awarded me substantial damages for the theft of my intellectual property. But the most satisfying part of the verdict was the punitive damages. The jury was so outraged by the evidence of systematic fraud that they awarded additional damages, specifically designed to punish my mentor and deter others from similar behavior. The total award was more than enough to cover my legal expenses and compensate me for the years of stress and lost opportunities. The financial impact on my former mentor was immediate and devastating. The punitive damages alone were more than his company could afford, and the legal fees from his team of expensive attorneys had already drained most of his resources. Within 6 months of the verdict, he was forced to file for bankruptcy and close his business permanently. The patent rights I'd won back turned out to be even more valuable than I'd anticipated. Several of the ideas I'd developed were eventually licensed to major technology companies, generating ongoing royalty payments that provided me with financial security for the first time in my life. The smart home sensor concept that had started everything was eventually implemented by a company that's now selling millions of units worldwide. More importantly, the case established legal precedent that made it easier for other inventors to pursue similar claims against people who steal their ideas. My attorney told me that several other inventors had successfully used our case as a template for their own lawsuits against fraudulent mentors and business partners. The personal satisfaction of winning was almost as important as the financial benefits. For 2 years, I'd been living with the knowledge that someone had systematically betrayed my trust and stolen my ideas. The legal victory validated everything I'd suspected and proved that I'd been right to fight back against someone who seemed much more powerful and connected than I was. Looking back on the entire experience, I realized that the lawsuit taught me more about business, law, and human nature than any mentorship ever could have. I learned to be skeptical of people who offer too much help for free, to document everything carefully, and to trust my instincts when something seems too good to be true. Those lessons have served me well in subsequent business dealings and have helped me avoid similar situations. I also learned that sometimes the most important battles are the ones that seem impossible to win. If I'd listened to the attorneys who told me I had no chance of success, my former mentor would still be out there stealing ideas from other young inventors. By fighting back, I not only recovered my own intellectual property, but also helped protect other inventors from falling victim to the same scam. The case also taught me about the importance of having proper legal representation when facing complex intellectual property disputes. My attorney's expertise and dedication were crucial to the success of the case. Without her knowledge of patent law and experience with invention theft cases, I never would have been able to navigate the legal system effectively. Today, I'm still working on new inventions and building my business, but I approach everything with much more caution and skepticism than I had before. I still seek advice and mentorship from experienced people, but I'm much more careful about who I trust and how much information I share. I've learned to verify people's credentials, check their backgrounds, and maintain control over my intellectual property at all times. The experience also motivated me to help other inventors avoid similar situations. I've started speaking at entrepreneur meetups and inventor groups, sharing my story and educating people about the warning signs of intellectual property theft. I've also worked with several young inventors on a consulting basis, helping them protect their ideas while they develop their businesses. In many ways, the lawsuit and its aftermath became a turning point in my life. What started as a devastating betrayal ultimately led to financial success, legal precedent, and a deeper understanding of how to protect intellectual property in a competitive business environment. The experience was painful and expensive, but it also gave me the knowledge and confidence to build a successful business on my own terms. The bankruptcy of my former mentor sent shockwaves through the local inventor community. Many people who had been considering working with him suddenly realized how close they'd come to falling victim to the same scam. Several other inventors came forward with similar stories, though most of them had discovered the theft too late to pursue legal action effectively. What I find most satisfying about the outcome is knowing that my former mentor can never again use his polished presentation and impressive office to gain the trust of vulnerable inventors. His reputation in the business community was completely destroyed, and his bankruptcy made it impossible for him to restart his fraudulent operation. The legal victory didn't just compensate me for my losses, it also permanently shut down his ability to victimize other people. The case also had broader implications for how intellectual property law is applied in mentor-student relationships. Several law schools have started using our case as an example in their intellectual property courses, showing students how fraudulent patent applications can be challenged and invalidated. The precedent we established has made it easier for other inventors to pursue similar claims when their trust has been betrayed. Looking at where I am now compared to where I was when I first met my mentor, I can honestly say that the lawsuit was one of the best investments I ever made. Not only did it recover my stolen intellectual property, but it also gave me the financial foundation to build a successful business without having to rely on questionable mentors or potentially fraudulent business partners. The experience taught me that sometimes the people who seem most helpful and trustworthy are actually the most dangerous. My former mentor's polished presentation and impressive credentials were just tools he used to gain the trust of his victims. The lesson I learned is that genuine expertise and honest intentions don't need to be sold with flashy presentations and too-good-to-be-true offers. Today, when I meet young inventors who are eager for guidance and mentorship, I always share my story and encourage them to be cautious about who they trust with their ideas. I tell them that the best mentors are usually the ones who are honest about the challenges and limitations of the business world, not the ones who promise easy success and quick profits. The intellectual property rights I recovered from the lawsuit continue to generate income through licensing agreements and royalties. Some of the ideas I developed years ago are still being used in products that are sold around the world. It's gratifying to know that my original concepts are finally being implemented and that I'm being properly compensated for my innovations. Perhaps most importantly, the experience gave me confidence in my ability to create valuable intellectual property and protect it from people who might try to steal it. Before the lawsuit, I was just another young inventor with big dreams and no real understanding of how the business world worked. After the lawsuit, I became someone who understood the value of intellectual property and knew how to protect it effectively. The 2 years I spent fighting the lawsuit were some of the most stressful and difficult of my life, but they were also some of the most educational. I learned more about law, business, and human nature during that time than I had in all the years before. The experience was like getting an advanced degree in intellectual property law, business ethics, and strategic thinking, all while fighting for my financial future. In the end, the lawsuit wasn't just about recovering my stolen ideas or getting financial compensation. It was about standing up to someone who had systematically abused the trust of vulnerable inventors and sending a message that such behavior wouldn't be tolerated. The fact that we were able to shut down his fraudulent operation and establish legal precedent for future cases made all the stress and expense worthwhile. The story of my legal battle has become something of a cautionary tale in the inventor community. People often reference it when discussing the importance of protecting intellectual property and being careful about who you trust with your ideas. It's become a reminder that even the most impressive and trustworthy-seeming mentors can sometimes have hidden agendas that aren't in your best interests. When I think about what would have happened if I hadn't discovered the patent applications and decided to fight back, I realize how different my life would be today. My former mentor would probably still be running his fraudulent operation, stealing ideas from other young inventors and building his wealth on their innovations. I would probably still be struggling to make ends meet while he profited from my work. The experience also taught me about the importance of persistence and determination when facing seemingly impossible challenges. There were many times during the lawsuit when I wanted to give up because the financial pressure was overwhelming and the outcome was uncertain. But staying committed to the fight ultimately led to a victory that changed my life in ways I never could have imagined. The intellectual property lawsuit that bankrupted my former mentor became a defining moment in my life, teaching me lessons about trust, business, and the importance of protecting what's rightfully yours. The experience was painful and expensive, but it ultimately led to financial success, legal vindication, and the satisfaction of knowing that I'd stood up to someone who had systematically abused the trust of vulnerable inventors like myself.